They called her just a paramedic when the helicopter started circling overhead, and the gunfire echoed through the Colorado mountains. Another small-town EMT who'd probably freeze up when things got real, they figured. Until Captain Marcus Blake looked through his rifle scope at the impossible shot that could end 12 hours of hell, turned to the woman crouched behind the ambulance, and said 5 words that would haunt Pine Valley forever. "Take the 50 cal and end this nightmare." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning started like any other Tuesday in Pine Valley, Colorado. Jessica Turner was restocking her ambulance outside Pine Valley General Hospital, checking 4 bags and oxygen tanks with the methodical precision that comes from 5 years of keeping people alive in the back of a speeding vehicle. The mountain air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of snow that would arrive before Halloween. She moved with an economy of motion that most people missed, her hands always knowing exactly where to find what she needed, her eyes constantly scanning for problems before they became emergencies. At 28, Jess had seen enough trauma to age most people beyond their years, but she carried it differently than others might expect. There was a stillness about her, a way of being present in crisis that seemed almost unnatural. Her colleagues at the hospital often commented on how she never seemed rattled, never seemed to panic, but they attributed it to experience rather than training of a different kind. They didn't know that before she'd learned to start IVs and intubate patients. She'd learned to steady her breathing under pressure in circumstances most civilians never had to imagine. Dr. Amanda Foster emerged from the emergency bay, coffee in hand and exhaustion written across her features. Another sleepless night in a small hospital where 3 doctors covered what should have been handled by twice that many. She nodded to Jess with the kind of professional respect that develops between people who've worked countless emergencies together. But even she didn't really know the woman who drove the ambulance with steady hands and spoke in calm, measured tones no matter what chaos surrounded them. The radio crackled to life just as Jess finished her equipment check. Unit 7, we've got a multiple vehicle collision on Highway 34, mile marker 18. Reports of entrapment and possible fatalities. Fire department is en route, but you're closest to scene. Jess keyed the microphone with practiced efficiency. Unit 7 responding, ETA 12 minutes. She climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and began the familiar ritual of emergency response, checking mirrors, testing sirens, running through mental checklists that had become second nature. Highway 34 wound through some of the most beautiful and treacherous terrain in Colorado, a ribbon of asphalt that followed the mountain contours with sharp curves and steep drop-offs that had claimed dozens of vehicles over the years. As Jess navigated the winding road, she could see smoke rising from somewhere ahead, black columns that spoke of burning fuel and twisted metal. The radio chattered with updates from responding units, but she filtered the noise, focusing on what she could control: her speed, her route, her mental preparation for whatever waited around the next bend. When she crested the hill at mile marker 18, the scene spread out below her like something from a disaster movie. A tour bus had jackknifed across both lanes after apparently trying to avoid a fallen tree, its rear end hanging over the guardrail above a 100-foot drop. 2 smaller vehicles had collided trying to stop, their occupants visible through cracked windshields. But it was the third vehicle that made Jess's blood run cold. A black SUV had flipped multiple times and come to rest against a cluster of boulders, its roof crushed and windows blown out. She could see movement inside, which meant survivors, but also the bright orange of flames beginning to lick at the undercarriage. She parked the ambulance at a safe distance and began her primary assessment, a skill she'd learned in paramedic school but refined through experience most of her classmates had never encountered. The tour bus passengers were shaken but mobile, already being assisted by good Samaritans who'd stopped to help. The two-car collision involved minor injuries, cuts and bruises that looked worse than they were. But the SUV demanded immediate attention, and as she approached, she could see why the situation was about to become critical. The vehicle was perched precariously on the edge of the slope, held in place by rocks and debris that could shift at any moment. Worse, the fuel line had ruptured, and the growing flames meant she had minutes, not hours, to extract whoever was inside. Officer David Mitchell arrived just as Jess was pulling medical equipment from her ambulance. He was young for a Colorado State Patrol officer, maybe 26, with the kind of by-the-book approach that came from recent academy training and a desire to prove himself worthy of the badge. He took one look at the scene and immediately began establishing a perimeter, directing traffic and calling for additional resources with the mechanical efficiency of someone following protocols he'd memorized, but never really tested. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to stay back from that vehicle until the fire department gets here with proper extraction equipment," Mitchell called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd been taught that controlling the scene was the first priority in any emergency response. Jess looked up from her equipment check, her green eyes measuring the officer with the same calm assessment she applied to medical emergencies. "How long until they arrive?" she asked, her voice steady despite the increasing urgency of the situation. Mitchell checked his radio. 15, maybe 20 minutes. They're coming from the main station in Boulder Creek." Jess looked back at the SUV, where she could now see two figures inside. One slumped over the steering wheel, and another in the passenger seat, who appeared to be conscious and trying to communicate. The flames were spreading faster than she'd initially calculated, and the vehicle's position on the loose rock slope meant that any significant structural failure could send it tumbling into the canyon below. 20 minutes might as well have been 20 hours. "Officer Mitchell," she said, her tone remaining professional but carrying a weight that made him pause. "Those people don't have 20 minutes. The fuel tank is compromised, and this whole area is unstable. We need to act now." Mitchell shook his head, his training overriding any instinct to defer to her medical expertise. "Ma'am, I understand your concern, but I can't authorize civilian personnel to enter an active hazard zone. We need to wait for properly equipped rescue personnel." It was the right answer according to his manual, the safe answer that protected him from liability and followed established protocols. But protocols were written by people who'd never had to watch someone burn alive because they followed rules, instead of doing what needed to be done. That's when Officer Lisa Johnson arrived, Mitchell's partner and a 10-year veteran who'd seen enough real emergencies to know the difference between textbook scenarios and actual life-or-death situations. She assessed the scene with experienced eyes, noting the precarious position of the SUV, the spreading flames, and the way Jess was moving with purpose rather than panic. "What's the situation?" she asked Mitchell, but her attention was on the paramedic who was now pulling rappelling equipment from a storage compartment most ambulances didn't carry. 2 victims in the SUV, unknown injuries. "Fire spreading from a ruptured fuel line," Jess replied before Mitchell could answer. "Vehicle is unstable on loose rock. I can stabilize them for extraction, but someone needs to secure the vehicle before it goes over the edge." Johnson looked at the equipment Jess was arranging with professional interest. Rappelling gear, climbing harnesses, anchor points, and medical supplies arranged with military precision. This wasn't standard paramedic equipment, and the way Jess handled it suggested training that went beyond emergency medical certification. "Where did you learn to use that gear?" Johnson asked, genuinely curious about the woman who seemed to be preparing for a rescue operation that would challenge experienced mountain rescue teams. Jess paused in her preparations, her hands stilling for just a moment before continuing with their methodical work. "I've had some additional training," she said simply, which was both completely true and utterly inadequate to describe the reality of where she'd learned to operate under pressure in hostile environments. The truth was that Jessica Turner had spent 4 years in the Army as a combat medic, but not just any combat medic. She'd been selected for assignment to special operations units, the kind of positions that required security clearances and resulted in service records that were mostly classified. She'd learned to provide medical care while under fire, to perform surgery in field conditions that would challenge most hospital operating rooms, and to handle weapons and tactical equipment with the same proficiency she applied to medical procedures. But that life belonged to someone else now. Someone who'd left the service and tried to build a quieter existence in a small Colorado town where the biggest emergencies involved car accidents and occasional heart attacks. The sound of groaning metal interrupted her thoughts. The SUV was shifting on its precarious perch, the rocks beneath it beginning to give way under the vehicle's weight, and the expansion caused by the growing heat. Through the smoke and flame, she could see the passenger more clearly now, a woman, probably in her 40s, conscious but trapped by dashboard intrusion. The driver appeared to be unconscious, his head at an angle that suggested significant trauma. If the vehicle went over the edge, or if the fire reached the main fuel tank, both would die, and there wouldn't be enough left to identify, let alone save. "I'm going in," Jess announced, buckling on a climbing harness and checking anchor points with practiced efficiency. Mitchell stepped forward, his hand moving instinctively toward his radio to call for backup, or perhaps to report an uncooperative civilian. "Ma'am, I'm ordering you to step back from the vehicle. You're not trained for this kind of rescue operation." The irony of his statement wasn't lost on Jess, who'd performed emergency medical procedures under conditions that would have left most people catatonic with fear. But she didn't argue with him, didn't waste time explaining credentials he wouldn't understand or believe. Instead, she looked at Officer Johnson, recognizing in the older woman's eyes the kind of experience that comes from seeing enough real emergencies to know when rules become obstacles rather than protections. 10 years ago, I pulled a family out of a burning house," Johnson said quietly to her partner. "Fire department was 20 minutes out, just like now. I could have followed protocol and waited, and I would have watched 5 people die." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Instead, I broke some rules and went home that night, knowing I'd saved 5 lives. Sometimes you have to choose between being right and being useful. The SUV shifted again, more dramatically this time, and the sound of breaking glass indicated that the passenger window had failed under the heat stress. Through the new opening, they could hear the woman inside calling for help, her voice weak but urgent. She was still conscious, still fighting, but time was running out faster than any of them had anticipated. The flames had reached the vehicle's interior, and smoke was beginning to pour from the broken window in thick, black streams that spoke of burning upholstery and plastic components. Jess finished her equipment check and moved toward the vehicle, her movements deliberate and confident despite the obvious danger. She'd rigged a safety line to her ambulance, creating a secure anchor point that would allow her to approach the SUV without falling if the ground gave way beneath her feet. Her medical bag was secured to her harness, positioned for quick access to trauma supplies she hoped she wouldn't need, but knew she probably would. As she approached the driver's side door, she could feel the heat radiating from the twisted metal and smell the acrid smoke that indicated the fire was spreading faster than she'd hoped. The driver's door was crushed shut, but years of experience had taught her to look for alternative access points. The rear passenger window on the uphill side was cracked but intact, and the doorframe appeared less damaged than the front of the vehicle. She moved around to that position, testing each step carefully on the unstable rock surface, constantly aware that a single misstep could send her tumbling down the mountainside alongside the people she was trying to save. Through the rear window, she could see both occupants more clearly. The driver was indeed unconscious, his breathing shallow and irregular in a way that suggested significant head trauma. The passenger was alert but trapped, her legs pinned beneath dashboard components that had been driven backward by the impact. Both were in immediate danger from the spreading fire, but the woman was conscious enough to understand their situation and was fighting panic with admirable determination. "My name is Jessica. I'm a paramedic," she called through the broken glass. "I'm going to get you out of here, but I need you to stay calm and do exactly what I tell you, okay?" The woman nodded, her eyes wide with fear but focused on Jess's voice. "My husband, is he?" She started to ask, but Jess cut her off with gentle firmness. "I'm going to take care of both of you, but right now I need you to focus on breathing slowly and staying as still as possible. Can you move your arms?" As she began her initial medical assessment through the window, Jess was also calculating extraction options and timing. The fire had spread to the vehicle's interior, but hadn't yet reached the main cabin area where the victims were trapped. She had maybe 10 minutes before the heat and smoke would make rescue impossible, and maybe 15 before the fuel tank could explode or the vehicle could tumble over the edge. It was a narrow window, but she'd worked in narrower ones before, under circumstances where the stakes had been measured in more than 2 lives. Officer Johnson approached from behind, moving carefully on the unstable ground. "What do you need?" she asked, recognizing that this was no longer a situation where protocol mattered as much as results. Jess appreciated the woman's pragmatic approach and began outlining her plan with the same clarity she'd once used to brief military operations. "I need to break this window and extract the passenger first. She's conscious and her injuries appear to be primarily crush trauma to the lower extremities. The driver has probable head trauma and will require spinal immobilization, but he's going to be harder to move because of his position." "What about the fire?" Johnson asked, noting how the flames had begun to move toward the passenger compartment with increasing intensity. Jess looked at the pattern of the fire spread, calculating fuel load and burn rates with knowledge that went beyond standard paramedic training. "We have maybe 8 minutes before it becomes unsurvivable in there. Maybe 12 before we lose structural integrity. After that, physics takes over, and we're looking at a recovery operation instead of a rescue." She positioned herself at the rear passenger window and used a spring-loaded punch to break the safety glass, clearing the opening quickly and efficiently. The woman inside turned toward the sound, hope and fear mixing in her expression as she realized rescue was actually possible. "What's your name?" Jess asked as she began to climb through the window opening, her movements careful and controlled despite the obvious urgency of the situation. "Linda," the woman replied. "Linda Patterson. Please, my husband Robert, he hasn't moved since the crash. I think he's hurt really bad." Jess was already performing a rapid trauma assessment, her hands moving over Linda's body to identify injuries and complications that could affect extraction. Crushed legs, probable fractures, but no immediate life threats if they could get her out before the fire reached her position. "Linda, I'm going to get you out first, then I'll come back for Robert. I need you to put your arms around my neck and hold on tight. This might hurt, but I need you to stay with me, okay?" The extraction process was complicated by Linda's injuries and the awkward angle required to pull her through the rear window, but Jess had performed similar procedures under worse conditions. She worked with steady hands and constant verbal reassurance, guiding Linda through each step of the process, while monitoring the fire's progress and the vehicle's stability. When they finally cleared the window and began the careful journey back to stable ground, Linda was conscious and responsive despite obvious pain from her leg injuries. Officer Johnson helped secure Linda in the ambulance, while Jess prepared for the more challenging extraction of Robert Patterson, who remained unconscious and would require spinal immobilization to prevent further injury during the rescue process. The fire had advanced significantly during Linda's extraction, and smoke was now pouring heavily from the vehicle's interior. The window opening she'd used to reach Linda was no longer viable due to flame location, which meant she'd have to find another access point for Robert's rescue. As she prepared to return to the vehicle, a new sound cut through the mountain air. Helicopters, multiple aircraft approaching from the direction of Fort Carson. The steady thrum of rotor blades grew louder as the aircraft came into view, military. Helicopters that seemed incongruous with what should have been a routine traffic accident response. Officer Mitchell looked up in confusion, reaching for his radio to inquire about the unexpected military presence. But Jess knew exactly why those helicopters were coming, and the knowledge filled her with a cold dread that had nothing to do with the burning vehicle or the rescue operation she was about to attempt. The black SUV she'd been trying to extract victims from wasn't just another civilian vehicle involved in an unfortunate accident. The license plates, the window tinting, the way it had been traveling alone on a mountain highway. Details she'd noted, but not fully processed until she heard the distinctive sound of military rotorcraft responding to what should have been local emergency. The lead helicopter circled the crash site once, before settling into a landing pattern in a clearing about 200 yards up the highway. As the aircraft touched down, figures in tactical gear began emerging, moving with the coordinated precision that spoke of special operations training. At their head was a man Jess recognized even from a distance, someone she'd hoped never to see again in circumstances like these. Captain Marcus Blake stepped away from the helicopter and surveyed the crash scene with the same analytical intensity he'd once applied to battlefields, in places that didn't appear on any public maps. His presence here meant that Robert and Linda Patterson weren't just innocent civilians caught in an unfortunate accident. They were either very important people or very dangerous ones, and either possibility meant that Jessica Turner's carefully constructed new life was about to collide with the past she'd tried so hard to leave behind. Captain Blake moved across the rocky terrain with the fluid efficiency of someone accustomed to operating in hostile environments, his tactical gear contrasting sharply with the civilian emergency responders who'd been managing the crash site. Behind him, 3 other operators spread out in a loose formation, their weapons lowered but ready, their eyes scanning the surrounding mountains with the paranoid alertness that kept special operations soldiers alive in places where relaxation meant death. The sight of them transformed what had been a traffic accident into something far more complex and dangerous. Officer Mitchell watched the approaching military personnel with growing confusion, his hand hovering near his radio as he tried to process why armed soldiers were responding to what should have been a routine emergency call. His training had covered multi-agency cooperation, but nothing had prepared him for the reality of special operations forces taking over his crash scene. "Sir, this is Officer Mitchell with Colorado State Patrol," he called out as Blake approached. "I'm going to need to see some identification and understand why you're here." Blake's response was to produce a leather credential case that contained identification Mitchell had never seen before, documents that carried federal authority and security classifications that made it clear this situation had moved far beyond local jurisdiction. Captain Marcus Blake, Joint Special Operations Command. This crash site is now under federal control pending investigation of potential national security implications. His voice carried the kind of authority that didn't invite argument, but Mitchell was young enough and proud enough to try anyway. "Sir, with respect, I have 2 injured civilians who need immediate medical attention, and I can't just turn over a traffic accident to military personnel without proper justification and chain of command authorization." It was the right thing to say according to his training, the proper response of a law enforcement officer, protecting civilian rights and maintaining jurisdictional integrity. But Blake had dealt with local authorities before, and he understood that sometimes education was more efficient than confrontation. Officer Mitchell, the man trapped in that vehicle, is Robert Patterson, former CIA operative who disappeared 3 months ago, along with classified intelligence that could compromise ongoing operations in 7 countries. The woman you just extracted is his handler, Linda Patterson, who's been running an unauthorized operation to sell those intelligence assets to foreign buyers. This stopped being a traffic accident the moment we identified their vehicle through satellite tracking. Blake's explanation was delivered with matter-of-fact precision, each word calculated to convey both the seriousness of the situation and the futility of continued resistance. Jess had been listening to this exchange while preparing for Robert Patterson's extraction, but Blake's words confirmed what she'd already begun to suspect. The timing was too convenient, the location too remote, and the circumstances too perfect for this to be an accidental encounter. Someone had been tracking the Pattersons, someone had known their route, and someone had arranged for this confrontation to happen in a place where civilian interference would be minimal. The fallen tree that had caused the initial accident hadn't fallen naturally. She could see saw marks on the trunk where it had been cut and positioned to create an unavoidable obstacle. Blake turned his attention to the burning SUV where Robert Patterson remained trapped, his unconscious form visible through the smoke that was growing thicker by the minute. "How long before the vehicle is completely compromised?" he asked, directing the question to Jess with the assumption that she was the medical authority on scene. She looked up from her equipment, meeting his eyes for the first time since his arrival, and saw recognition flicker across his features as he realized who she was. "Jessica Turner," he said quietly, using her civilian name but speaking it with the tone of someone who remembered her by a different designation entirely. "I didn't expect to find you here." His voice carried layers of meaning that the other emergency responders couldn't interpret, references to shared experiences and classified operations that belonged to a different world than the one where she now worked as a small-town paramedic. "I didn't expect to be found," she replied, her own voice steady despite the implications of this encounter. Blake's presence meant that her carefully constructed new identity had been compromised, that someone in the intelligence community had been keeping track of her, despite her efforts to disappear into civilian life. It also meant that whatever was happening here involved more than just a rogue CIA operative and his handler trying to sell classified information. Blake nodded toward the trapped man in the SUV. "We need him alive for questioning. Whatever intelligence he's carrying dies with him if we can't extract him safely." It was a statement of operational priorities rather than humanitarian concern, the kind of cold calculation that had characterized most of their previous interactions. But Jess had learned to see past the tactical mindset to the underlying reality of what needed to be accomplished. "The fires reached the interior cabin," she said, assessing the situation with professional detachment. "He's got maybe 6 minutes before smoke inhalation becomes fatal. Maybe 10 before the heat kills him, even if we could somehow provide oxygen. The fuel tank hasn't exploded yet, but it's going to, and when it does, the blast will probably send what's left of the vehicle over the cliff." She paused, calculating risks and probabilities with the same analytical approach Blake was using. "I can get him out, but it's going to require equipment and procedures that aren't exactly standard for civilian emergency response." One of Blake's operators, a compact man with the weathered features of someone who'd spent years in desert environments, moved closer to examine the vehicle's position. "Sir, the whole thing's balanced on about 3 rocks and some loose gravel. Any significant vibration could send it over the edge before we can complete extraction." His assessment was delivered with the clinical precision of someone accustomed to evaluating tactical situations under pressure. Blake considered the variables for several seconds, weighing operational priorities against acceptable risk levels. Robert Patterson was a valuable intelligence asset, but he was also a traitor who'd stolen classified information and endangered ongoing operations. The information he carried was valuable enough to justify significant risk to recover, but not valuable enough to sacrifice trained special operations personnel in a rescue attempt with minimal probability of success. "What do you need?" he asked Jess, making the decision to trust her assessment and capabilities. I need your people to secure the vehicle so it doesn't go over the cliff while I'm inside extracting him," she said, already pulling additional equipment from her ambulance's storage compartments. "And I need someone who can handle the medical side of spinal immobilization while I focus on the technical aspects of the extraction." She was moving with the kind of focused intensity that Blake remembered from their previous operations together. When she'd been known by her military designation and had performed emergency medical procedures under conditions that would challenge most hospital trauma teams. Sergeant Tony Russo stepped forward from Blake's team, his medical cross insignia indicating advanced tactical medical training. "I can handle spinal immobilization and trauma stabilization," he offered, already assessing the approach routes and equipment requirements for the operation. Like most special operations medics, his training went far beyond basic first aid to include surgical procedures and trauma management that bordered on physician-level expertise. Officer Johnson watched this exchange with growing understanding that she was witnessing something far beyond her experience or authority. The way the military personnel and the paramedic communicated suggested shared background and training that placed them in a different category entirely from civilian emergency responders. "Should I be calling for additional backup?" she asked Blake, recognizing that her role in this situation had become largely observational. "No additional civilian personnel," Blake replied firmly. "This operation is now classified under national security provisions. Anyone already on scene can remain, but no additional responders until we've completed the extraction and secured the intelligence materials." It was a polite way of saying that too many witnesses would complicate the post-incident debriefing and classification process that would follow. Jess had finished her equipment preparation and was ready to attempt Robert Patterson's extraction. But the increased fire intensity and vehicle instability made the operation significantly more dangerous than Linda's earlier rescue. The access routes she'd used before were no longer viable, and the smoke had become dense enough to require breathing apparatus for anyone spending more than a few seconds inside the vehicle. "I'm going to need cover from the smoke in some way to stabilize him during extraction that doesn't require perfect spinal alignment," she said to Russo. "We can rig a hasty rappel system to control his movement during extraction," Russo suggested, examining the vehicle's position and the available anchor points. "If we can get him onto a backboard inside the vehicle, we can use mechanical advantage to lift him straight up and out through the roof area where the structure's been compromised." It was a complex technical solution that would require precise coordination between multiple people working in extremely hazardous conditions. Blake was monitoring the overall situation while his specialists focused on extraction planning, but his attention was also divided between the immediate tactical requirements and the larger implications of finding Jessica Turner working as a civilian paramedic in a small Colorado town. Her presence here wasn't coincidental. People with her background and training didn't end up in places like Pine Valley by accident. Someone had placed her here, someone had been tracking her, and someone had known she'd be available to respond to this particular emergency. The sound of additional helicopters approaching interrupted his analysis. These weren't military aircraft, but civilian emergency response helicopters, probably medical evacuation and fire suppression resources that had been dispatched according to standard emergency protocols. Their arrival would complicate the operational security situation and potentially expose classified aspects of the mission to personnel who lacked appropriate clearances. "Johnson, get on your radio and divert those aircraft to a holding pattern 5 miles out," Blake ordered. "Tell them we have a hazardous materials situation that requires specialized response teams." It wasn't entirely untrue. The classified intelligence that Robert Patterson carried certainly qualified as hazardous material from a national security perspective. Officer Johnson complied with the request, though her expression indicated growing discomfort with the way this situation had evolved beyond normal emergency response procedures. She'd been a law enforcement officer long enough to recognize when something was happening that extended beyond her understanding or authority. But she'd also been trained to maintain civilian oversight of law enforcement activities regardless of who claimed jurisdiction. Jess and Russo had moved into position near the SUV and were beginning their final approach when the vehicle shifted again, this time more dramatically than before. The rock supporting its rear end had begun to crumble under the combined effects of heat expansion and mechanical stress, creating a cascade failure that threatened to send the entire structure tumbling into the canyon before they could complete the extraction. "We're out of time," Jess announced, abandoning her careful approach in favor of immediate action. She moved through the vehicle's compromised roof structure with fluid efficiency, her movements economical and precise, despite the obvious danger and the thick smoke that limited visibility to inches in some areas. Russo followed closely behind, carrying spinal immobilization equipment and breathing apparatus that would allow them to work inside the smoke-filled interior for the few minutes they'd need to complete the extraction process. Robert Patterson was still unconscious, but his vital signs had deteriorated significantly since the beginning of the rescue operation. The smoke inhalation and heat exposure had combined with his initial trauma to create a medical emergency that would challenge even the most advanced hospital trauma teams. His breathing was shallow and irregular, his pulse was weak and rapid, and his skin had taken on the grayish pallor that indicated severe systemic shock. "He's going into respiratory failure," Russo reported as he began attaching monitoring equipment and establishing intravenous access for emergency medications. "We need to intubate him now, or he's not going to survive the extraction process." The decision to perform advanced airway management inside a burning vehicle was the kind of calculated risk that separated special operations medical personnel from conventional emergency responders. Jess was working simultaneously to secure Patterson to a backboard while Russo managed his medical stabilization, both of them operating in the confined space and dangerous conditions with the kind of coordinated efficiency that came from extensive training and shared experience. The heat inside the vehicle had become nearly unbearable, and the smoke was dense enough to obscure vision even with protective equipment. 30 seconds, Blake called from outside the vehicle, his voice barely audible over the sound of burning fuel and creaking metal. The vehicle's structural integrity was failing faster than they'd calculated, and the margin for error had shrunk to almost nothing. Either they completed the extraction in the next few moments, or they'd have to abandon the attempt and accept that Robert Patterson would die along with whatever intelligence information he carried. The backboard system they'd rigged allowed them to lift Patterson straight up through the vehicle's compromised roof structure, but the process required precise timing and coordination to avoid causing additional spinal trauma during the emergency extraction. Russo maintained airway control and medical monitoring while Jess handled the mechanical aspects of moving Patterson's unconscious form through the twisted metal and debris that blocked their exit route. When they finally cleared the vehicle and reached stable ground, Robert Patterson was barely alive. His breathing had stopped entirely, requiring immediate resuscitation efforts that Russo began even before they'd moved him to a safe distance from the burning SUV. Jess assisted with the emergency medical procedures while Blake's other operators established a secure perimeter and began the process of documenting and securing whatever intelligence materials they could recover from the crash site. The SUV finally succumbed to structural failure just as they reached minimum safe distance, the rear support rocks giving way entirely and sending the burning vehicle tumbling down the mountainside in a spectacular cascade of fire and twisted metal. The explosion when it reached the bottom of the canyon was visible from their position, a pillar of flame and smoke that would be seen for miles in every direction. Officer Mitchell watched the destruction with obvious shock. The reality of how close they'd all come to disaster finally sinking in as he realized that 2 people had been inside that inferno just minutes before. "Jesus Christ," he muttered, his voice shaky with the aftermath of adrenaline and fear. "How did you guys know to do all that? That wasn't normal paramedic training." Blake looked at Jess, who was now focused entirely on assisting with Robert Patterson's emergency medical treatment, her civilian identity maintained despite the obvious military precision with which she'd conducted the rescue operation. The question of her background and training would have to be addressed, but not in front of civilian witnesses who lacked appropriate security clearances. "Some people are just better under pressure," Blake replied diplomatically, knowing that the real explanation would have to wait until they could speak privately. Jessica Turner had been one of the most capable special operations medical personnel he'd ever worked with, someone who'd performed emergency medical procedures in combat zones that most people couldn't imagine. Her presence in Pine Valley wasn't coincidental, and her involvement in this operation raised questions about intelligence leaks and operational security that would require immediate investigation. Linda Patterson had regained consciousness during the rescue operation and was now sitting in the ambulance under Officer Johnson's supervision. Her leg injuries stabilized, but her emotional state fragile as she processed the reality of her situation. She'd been caught in the middle of an intelligence operation that had gone sideways, and her husband was fighting for his life as a result of decisions they'd made together. The classified information they'd been trying to sell was now in federal custody, and their carefully planned escape had ended in disaster. "Is he going to live?" she asked Jess, who was working alongside Russo to stabilize Robert Patterson's condition enough for transport to a medical facility with advanced trauma capabilities. The question carried layers of meaning beyond simple spousal concern. If Robert died, Linda would be the only witness to whatever intelligence operation they'd been conducting, making her both valuable and vulnerable to whoever had been tracking them. "He's stable for transport," Jess replied professionally, avoiding the more complex question of long-term prognosis given the extent of his injuries and the circumstances of his treatment. The emergency medical procedures they'd performed had kept him alive, but he would need immediate surgical intervention and intensive care management to have any realistic chance of survival. Blake was coordinating with his operations center to arrange secure medical transport and ensuring that both Patterson survivors would be transferred to a federal facility where their medical treatment could be managed alongside their interrogation and debriefing. The intelligence information they'd been carrying was only part of a larger operation that involved multiple agencies and ongoing investigations across several countries. As the immediate emergency response concluded and the various agencies began the complex process of evidence collection and jurisdiction transfer, Blake found an opportunity to speak privately with Jessica, turn her away from the civilian witnesses who'd been present during the rescue operation. What he had to tell her would fundamentally alter her understanding of why she'd been in Pine Valley and what her role in this operation had really been. The afternoon sun was beginning to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the crash site where multiple agencies were now working to piece together the events that had led to this confrontation. For Jessica Turner, the quiet life she'd built in Pine Valley was about to become a memory, replaced by the complex and dangerous world she'd thought she'd left behind forever. Blake led Jess away from the crash site toward a cluster of pine trees that provided both privacy and a clear view of the surrounding area. His movements casual, but his eyes constantly scanning for potential threats or unwanted observers. The weight of what he needed to tell her settled between them like an invisible barrier. Years of shared history and classified operations that couldn't be discussed in front of civilian witnesses but demanded immediate attention given the circumstances they now faced. "You know this wasn't coincidental," he said without preamble, his voice low enough to avoid being overheard, but carrying the gravity of someone delivering information that would fundamentally alter her understanding of recent events. "Your assignment to Pine Valley the timing of your shift today, even the route you took to respond to this emergency call. None of it was random. Jess had suspected as much from the moment she'd seen the military helicopters, but hearing it confirmed still sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "How long have you been tracking me?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer would be longer than she wanted to hear. The life she'd built in Colorado had felt genuine. The relationship she'd formed with colleagues and patients had seemed real. But Blake's presence suggested that even her most private moments had been under some form of surveillance. "Since the day you separated from the service," Blake replied, confirming her worst suspicions about the extent to which her post-military life had been monitored and managed. "The Pentagon doesn't just let people walk away from special access programs without maintaining some level of oversight, especially when those people possess the kind of specialized knowledge and training you carry. Your medical expertise combined with your tactical background makes you a unique asset that the intelligence community couldn't simply lose track of." The implications of his statement went far beyond simple career tracking or veteran services coordination. Jessica Turner, the civilian paramedic, had been a carefully constructed identity, but one that had been designed and maintained by people who had their own operational requirements and strategic objectives. Her job in Pine Valley, her apartment, her social connections, even her romantic relationships had potentially been influenced or monitored by intelligence personnel who saw her as a resource rather than a person trying to build a normal life. "The Pattersons," she said, understanding beginning to crystallize as she processed the operational complexity that would have been required to orchestrate today's events. They weren't just random CIA rogues trying to sell classified information. They were being used to flush out someone specific, someone who had access to their operational history and could identify the intelligence they were carrying. Blake nodded grimly. "Robert Patterson was recruited by a foreign intelligence service 18 months ago, but we allowed the recruitment to proceed because we needed to understand the full extent of their intelligence network and identify other assets they might have developed within our system. The information he was carrying today wasn't just stolen classified material. It was carefully crafted disinformation designed to expose enemy intelligence operations when it was analyzed by their technical teams. The sophistication of the operation was beginning to become clear. Layers of deception and counterintelligence that extended far beyond the simple car accident she'd responded to that morning. But something went wrong," she continued, following the logical progression of events that would have led to the current situation. "Either Patterson figured out he was being used, or his handler suspected the intelligence was compromised, or someone else entirely was tracking the operation for their own purposes. All three, actually," Blake said with the weary tone of someone who'd spent years navigating the complex world of modern intelligence operations where every action generated multiple reactions and unintended consequences. Patterson discovered he was being fed false information and attempted to disappear with his handler, but his foreign contacts had already begun to suspect the intelligence was compromised. Meanwhile, a separate foreign intelligence service had been tracking our counterintelligence operation and was planning to intercept the Pattersons for their own purposes. Jess looked back toward the crash site where multiple agencies were, still processing evidence and coordinating the complex logistics of a multi-jurisdictional intelligence operation. So the car accident wasn't an accident, but it also wasn't planned by any of the primary players. Someone else was responsible for forcing the confrontation today. The realization that there were additional actors in this operation, people, or organizations with their own objectives and capabilities, made the situation exponentially more complex and dangerous. "We believe the tree was positioned by a third party who wanted to force a confrontation between Patterson and whoever was tracking him," Blake confirmed. "Satellite imagery shows it was cut and placed sometime during the night, probably by operatives who knew the route Patterson would be taking, but didn't know we were already monitoring the situation. When the Pattersons crashed, it triggered a cascade of emergency responses that brought all the various players into direct contact. The question that remained unspoken, but hung heavily between them, was why Jessica Turner had been positioned in Pine Valley to respond to this particular emergency, and what her role was supposed to be in the larger operation that was still unfolding. Blake's explanation of the intelligence background provided context, but it didn't explain why someone with her specialized training had been placed in exactly the right position to respond when the situation escalated beyond conventional emergency response capabilities. "My assignment here wasn't just about keeping track of me," she said, understanding dawning as she processed the operational requirements that would have led to her placement in a small Colorado town. Someone knew this confrontation was going to happen, and they needed medical personnel with tactical training available to handle the aftermath. "You positioned me here because you expected casualties and needed someone who could provide advanced trauma care under hostile conditions." Blake's expression confirmed her analysis while simultaneously revealing the complexity of the intelligence operation that had been built around today's events. The Patterson operation was always expected to end in violence. Too many different intelligence services were involved, too many competing objectives, too much valuable information at stake. We needed someone in position who could provide emergency medical care while maintaining operational security and handling classified materials appropriately. The weight of being used as an unwitting asset in an intelligence operation settled on Jess like a physical burden. The realization that her entire civilian life had been structured around operational requirements she hadn't been told about. How many other people in Pine Valley are actually intelligence assets? She asked, wondering about her colleagues at the hospital, her neighbors, the people she'd begun to think of as friends and community members. "Fewer than you might think, more than you'd want to know," Blake replied diplomatically, acknowledging the uncomfortable reality that modern intelligence operations required extensive networks of assets and resources that often involved civilian cover identities. Most of the people in your life are exactly what they appear to be. But some key positions, people who might be in a position to provide support or information if needed, those were filled with people who have appropriate backgrounds and clearances. Dr. Amanda Foster's quick acceptance of Jess's unusual equipment and training suddenly took on new meaning, as did the efficiency with which certain administrative processes had been handled when she'd first arrived in Pine Valley. The community she'd thought she was joining had been partially constructed around operational requirements, designed to provide cover and support for intelligence activities that might become necessary under certain circumstances. "What happens now?" she asked, though she suspected the answer would involve a return to the world of classified operations and dangerous assignments she'd tried to leave behind. Blake's presence and the events of today had effectively ended her civilian life, regardless of what choices she made going forward. Too many people now knew about her background and capabilities. Too many intelligence services were aware of her involvement in today's operation. That depends partially on what we find when Patterson regains consciousness, and we can debrief him about the full extent of his intelligence activities, Blake said, watching as the medical helicopter prepared to transport both Patterson survivors to a secure federal facility. But it also depends on whether you're willing to accept a more active role in ongoing operations that require your specific combination of medical and tactical expertise. The offer wasn't entirely unexpected, but it still represented a fundamental choice about what kind of life she wanted to live and what kind of person she wanted to be. The quiet existence she'd built in Pine Valley had been satisfying in ways she hadn't anticipated. The routine of civilian medical practice and the relationship she'd developed with patients and colleagues had provided a sense of purpose and normalcy that she'd never experienced during her military service. But today's events had also reminded her of the unique capabilities she possessed, and the satisfaction that came from using those skills in situations where they could make a real difference between life and death. The rescue of Robert and Linda. Patterson had required exactly the kind of specialized training and experience that most civilian emergency responders would never encounter, and she'd performed under pressure with an effectiveness that demonstrated the value of her background and training. Officer Johnson approached from the direction of the crash site, her expression indicating that she had information that needed to be shared, but wasn't sure how much she should reveal in front of the military personnel who had taken control of the investigation. "Ma'am, we've got local news crews setting up about 2 miles down the highway, and the sheriff's department is asking for a briefing on what happened here today. How much are we supposed to tell them about the circumstances of the accident?" Blake looked at Jess before answering, recognizing that the media attention and official inquiries would require careful management to protect both ongoing operations and the cover identities of people who had been involved in today's events. Standard traffic accident with complications due to fire and vehicle instability. The military presence was a training exercise that happened to be in the area when additional personnel were needed for the rescue operation. No mention of federal agencies or classified materials. It was the kind of cover story that would satisfy casual inquiry while providing enough official documentation to support more detailed investigation if necessary. But it also meant that Jessica Turner's role in the rescue operation would be officially minimized to protect her civilian identity. Her exceptional performance under dangerous conditions would be attributed to luck and basic training, rather than the specialized expertise she'd actually demonstrated. "What about the equipment she used?" Johnson asked, clearly puzzled by the sophisticated gear that Jess had produced from her ambulance. That wasn't standard paramedic equipment, and the way she handled it suggested training that goes way beyond civilian emergency medical certification. "The other EMTs in the county are going to ask questions when they hear about what happened here today." Blake exchanged glances with Jess again, both of them recognizing that maintaining her civilian cover story would require explanations that could withstand professional scrutiny from people who understood emergency medical procedures and equipment requirements. Additional training and equipment purchases funded through federal grants for rural emergency response enhancement, he said smoothly. It's not uncommon for paramedics in remote areas to receive supplemental training for wilderness rescue and technical emergency response. The explanation was plausible enough to satisfy casual inquiry, but Jess knew it wouldn't withstand detailed investigation by people who were genuinely curious about her background and capabilities. Today's rescue operation had been too visible, too dramatic, and too successful for her to return to complete anonymity as a small-town paramedic. Her cover identity had been partially compromised, and that reality would affect her ability to continue living and working in Pine Valley regardless of what official story was constructed around today's events. Dr. Foster had arrived at the crash site in her personal vehicle, probably responding to reports of multiple casualties and potential need for additional medical personnel at the scene. She surveyed the aftermath of the rescue operation with professional interest, noting the sophisticated medical equipment and advanced procedures that had been employed to stabilize the Patterson casualties. Her attention focused particularly on the emergency airway management and trauma stabilization that had been performed under extremely challenging conditions. "Jessica, I need to understand what level of training you actually have," she said directly, her tone carrying both professional curiosity and personal concern for someone she'd worked with for months, without fully understanding their qualifications and background. "What you accomplished here today goes beyond anything I've seen from paramedics with standard certification. And some of the procedures you used aren't typically authorized for pre-hospital emergency care." The question was legitimate from both medical and legal perspectives, since Dr. Foster would be required to document and potentially defend the advanced medical procedures that had been performed under her overall supervision as the regional emergency medical director. Jess's actions had saved lives, but they'd also potentially exceeded the scope of practice defined by her civilian medical certification and training records. I have some additional certifications and training that aren't reflected in my standard employment records, Jess replied carefully, trying to provide enough information to satisfy professional requirements while maintaining the operational security that Blake had indicated was necessary. Military medical training and specialized emergency response certification that qualify me for advanced procedures under specific circumstances. Dr. Foster nodded thoughtfully, her medical background allowing her to understand both the value of such training and the reasons why it might not be fully documented in civilian employment records. Military medical personnel often possessed capabilities that exceeded civilian paramedic training, but translating those qualifications into civilian certification could be complex and time-consuming. Blake stepped forward to provide official context for Jess's background without revealing classified details about her specific service record or current status with federal intelligence agencies. Ms. Turner has federal certification for emergency medical response in complex tactical situations, which authorized the advanced procedures she employed during today's rescue operation. The documentation for that certification is maintained at a federal level due to security considerations related to the training program. It was another carefully constructed explanation that provided enough official authority to satisfy immediate questions while maintaining the ambiguity necessary to protect operational details that couldn't be discussed publicly. Dr. Foster accepted the explanation with the pragmatic understanding that some aspects of federal training and certification programs involved security considerations that exceeded her clearance level or need to know. The sound of additional vehicles arriving at the scene interrupted their conversation. Local law enforcement and emergency response personnel who had been dispatched according to standard protocols but were arriving to find a situation that had already been managed by federal agencies operating under different authorities and procedures. Sheriff Dennis Crawford stepped out of his vehicle and began surveying the scene with the experienced eye of someone who had dealt with complex, multi-agency situations throughout his career in rural Colorado law enforcement. "Looks like we've got quite a situation here," he said to Officer Johnson, his tone neutral but his attention clearly focused on understanding what had happened and what role his department should play in the ongoing investigation and response efforts. Sheriff Crawford had been elected to his position based partly on his ability to work effectively with federal agencies when necessary, but also on his commitment to protecting the interests of local citizens and maintaining appropriate civilian oversight of law enforcement activities. Blake approached the sheriff with the same diplomatic efficiency he'd demonstrated with the other civilian authorities, understanding that successful cooperation required treating local officials with respect while maintaining federal jurisdiction over sensitive aspects of the operation. "Sheriff Crawford, I'm Captain Blake with Joint Special Operations Command. We've got a federal investigation in progress related to national security matters, but we appreciate your department's cooperation and assistance with the civilian emergency response aspects of today's incident." The sheriff listened to Blake's explanation while mentally cataloging the various federal agencies and military personnel who were operating within his jurisdiction, the sophisticated equipment and procedures that had been employed, and the obvious complexity of an operation that extended far beyond the traffic accident that had initially brought everyone to this location. His primary concern was ensuring that federal activities within his county were conducted appropriately and that local citizens' rights and interests were protected throughout the process. "Captain, I understand the federal jurisdiction aspect, but I've got citizens who were involved in this incident, and I've got media and political pressure that's going to require some level of public explanation about what happened here today," he said diplomatically but firmly. "I need to understand how much of this is going to remain classified and how much my department needs to be prepared to discuss publicly." Blake appreciated the sheriff's direct approach and recognized that maintaining good relationships with local authorities was essential for ongoing operations that might require future cooperation and support. The traffic accident and emergency medical response are matters of public record that can be discussed according to your standard procedures. The federal investigation aspects will remain classified, but they don't affect the local jurisdiction. Issues are your department's handling of the civilian emergency response. As the various agencies continued their coordination and evidence collection activities, Jessica Turner found herself in an increasingly complex position between her civilian identity and her intelligence background, between the life she'd tried to build in Pine Valley and the operational world that was reclaiming her. The choices she made in the next few hours would determine not only her own future, but potentially the success or failure of intelligence operations that extended across multiple countries and involved national security interests she was only beginning to understand. The mountain shadows were growing longer as the afternoon progressed toward evening, and the crash site was beginning to take on the organized efficiency of a major federal investigation rather than the chaotic urgency of an emergency response operation. For Jessica Turner, the transition represented the end of one chapter of her life and the uncertain beginning of another, with consequences she couldn't fully predict but would have to face regardless of what choices she made about her future. 3 weeks later, Jessica Turner stood in a sterile conference room buried deep beneath the federal building in Denver, surrounded by intelligence officials whose names she would never know and whose faces she would be expected to forget. The windowless space felt more like a bunker than a meeting room, its walls lined with technical equipment designed to prevent electronic surveillance, and its atmosphere heavy with the weight of classified conversations that could reshape international relations. Robert Patterson had survived his injuries, though his recovery had been complicated by the smoke inhalation and trauma he'd sustained during the mountain rescue. More importantly for the intelligence community, he had proven to be a valuable source of information about foreign intelligence operations that extended far beyond the simple case of stolen, classified documents that had initially brought him to federal attention. His debriefing sessions had revealed a network of compromised assets and ongoing operations that threatened American interests across multiple continents. The information Patterson provided has allowed us to identify and neutralize 17 foreign intelligence assets operating within our government agencies, said Deputy Director Catherine Walsh, a woman whose unremarkable appearance concealed one of the sharpest analytical minds in the intelligence community. But it's also revealed the existence of a much larger operation that we're only beginning to understand, one that has been developing assets and capabilities for over a decade. Blake sat across the conference table from Jess, his expression neutral but his attention focused on her reactions as the full scope of the intelligence operation was revealed. The rescue on the mountain highway had been just the beginning of a much larger confrontation between competing intelligence services, one that would require specialized personnel with unique combinations of skills and experience to navigate successfully. The Foreign Intelligence Service that recruited Patterson has been systematically targeting American personnel with medical and tactical backgrounds, Walsh continued, her briefing supported by satellite photographs and intercepts that painted a picture of sophisticated long-term planning. They've identified the strategic value of assets who can operate in both civilian and military environments, people who can provide emergency medical care while maintaining operational security under hostile conditions. The implications of her statement were clear even before she made them explicit. Jessica Turner's combination of special operations, medical training, and civilian paramedic experience made her exactly the kind of asset that foreign intelligence services were actively seeking to recruit or neutralize. Her involvement in the Patterson rescue had been noted by multiple intelligence agencies, and her capabilities were now a matter of international interest rather than simply domestic personnel management. Which means I can't go back to Pine Valley, Jess said, understanding the reality of her situation even before it was officially confirmed. Her civilian identity had been compromised not just by her association with the rescue operation, but by the broader intelligence implications of demonstrating her capabilities in a public context that had been observed and analyzed by foreign intelligence services. Not safely and not without putting the people around you at risk, Blake confirmed. Your cover identity was effective for routine civilian life, but it was never designed to withstand the kind of international attention that today's operation has generated. Foreign intelligence services now know you exist. They know what you're capable of, and they'll be looking for ways to either recruit you or eliminate you as a potential threat to their operations. Dr. Foster had been asking questions about Jess's background and training ever since the mountain rescue. Professional curiosity that had gradually evolved into concern as she realized that her colleague possessed capabilities that suggested a much more complex background than her employment records indicated. The official explanations about federal training programs and specialized certifications had satisfied immediate questions, but they hadn't addressed the deeper inconsistencies that an experienced physician could identify. She's been receiving calls from medical facilities across the country, Walsh said, consulting a file that contained surveillance reports and intercept data that made it clear Jess's communications had been monitored extensively. Job offers that are significantly above market rate for paramedic positions, opportunities that would place her in major metropolitan areas where her activities could be more easily observed and her capabilities more readily exploited. The job offers weren't coincidental recruitment efforts by legitimate medical facilities looking for experienced personnel. They were intelligence operations designed to move Jessica Turner into positions where she could be accessed, studied, and potentially compromised by foreign operatives who understood the strategic value of her unique skill set. Every phone call and email had been analyzed for operational significance. Every opportunity evaluated as a potential security threat. What are my options? Jess asked, though she suspected the answer would involve a return to active intelligence operations rather than any realistic possibility of maintaining a civilian lifestyle. The world she'd tried to leave behind had reclaimed her through circumstances beyond her control, and the choices available to her would be determined by strategic considerations rather than personal preferences. We can provide you with a new civilian identity and placement in a location where foreign intelligence services are less likely to identify and track you, Walsh offered, though her tone suggested this wasn't the preferred option from an operational perspective. Complete background reconstruction, new employment history, relocation to a position where your medical skills can be utilized without exposing your tactical capabilities. Blake leaned forward slightly, his body language indicating that he had additional information that would influence her decision-making process. Or you can accept active assignment to a joint task force that's been established to counter the foreign intelligence operations we've identified through the Patterson case. Your medical and tactical background would be invaluable for operations that require personnel who can provide emergency care while maintaining operational security under hostile conditions. The choice between hiding and fighting was really no choice at all for someone with Jessica Turner's background and temperament. She'd spent years in special operations precisely because she was the kind of person who preferred confronting problems directly rather than avoiding them, and the idea of spending the rest of her life looking over her shoulder while foreign intelligence services planned operations against American interests didn't appeal to her. What kind of operations are we talking about? She asked, recognizing that she was already leaning toward accepting active assignment despite the personal costs and professional risks involved. The quiet life she'd built in Pine Valley had been satisfying, but it had also been partially artificial, constructed around operational requirements she hadn't been told about rather than genuine personal choices. Counterintelligence operations designed to identify and neutralize Foreign assets operating within our intelligence and military communities, Blake replied, his explanation supported by briefing materials that outlined the scope and complexity of the threats they'd identified. Medical support for special operations activities in denied areas, where conventional medical resources aren't available or appropriate. Training and development of assets who can operate effectively in both civilian and military environments. The operations he described would require exactly the kind of specialized capabilities that had led to her original recruitment into special operations medical programs, skills that couldn't be easily replaced or replicated through conventional training programs. Her combination of advanced medical training and tactical experience represented years of investment in specialized education and practical experience that had significant strategic value for ongoing intelligence operations. Linda Patterson had also survived the mountain rescue, though her emotional and psychological recovery had been more complex than her physical healing. The realization that she'd been manipulated by multiple intelligence services throughout her relationship with Robert had left her questioning everything she thought she understood about their life together and their professional activities. Her debriefing sessions had provided valuable intelligence about foreign recruitment techniques and operational methods, but they'd also revealed the personal costs of intelligence work on the people who became involved in it. She's agreed to cooperate with our ongoing investigation, Walsh said, consulting additional files that contained Linda's statement and analysis of her intelligence value. Her background in intelligence analysis and her direct experience with foreign recruitment operations make her a valuable asset for understanding how these networks operate and how they can be disrupted. The broader investigation had revealed a sophisticated intelligence operation that had been developing assets and capabilities within the American intelligence community for over a decade, using recruitment techniques that targeted personnel with specialized skills and access to classified information. Robert and Linda Patterson had been just two components of a much larger network that included assets in multiple agencies and military services. The operation against the Pattersons was designed to flush out other assets in the network by forcing them to respond to a crisis situation, Blake explained, providing context for the complex intelligence activities that had led to the mountain confrontation. We knew foreign intelligence services were monitoring our activities, and we used that knowledge to create a situation where they would have to expose their capabilities and personnel to protect their investment in the Patterson assets. The sophistication of the counterintelligence operation impressed Jess, while simultaneously making her realize how completely she'd been manipulated throughout her civilian life in Pine Valley. Her placement there hadn't been random or even simply precautionary. It had been a deliberate component of a larger intelligence operation designed to create the conditions necessary for today's confrontation and the intelligence opportunities it had generated. How many other people have been placed in similar positions without knowing they were part of intelligence operations? She asked, wondering about the extent to which civilian communities were being used as cover for intelligence activities and how many supposedly normal citizens were actually assets being positioned for future operational requirements. More than you might expect, fewer than would be necessary if we were planning comprehensive domestic intelligence operations, Walsh replied diplomatically, acknowledging the uncomfortable reality that modern intelligence requirements often involved civilian cover identities and community penetration. Most of the people in your life in Pine Valley were exactly what they appeared to be, but some key positions required people with appropriate backgrounds and clearances. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Hayes, a military intelligence officer whose presence indicated that the discussion was about to move from general briefing to specific operational planning. She carried classified materials that would outline the exact nature of the assignment being offered to Jessica Turner and the strategic context that made her participation valuable to ongoing intelligence operations. The task force assignment would involve immediate deployment to locations where foreign intelligence services are conducting active operations against American interests. Hayes explained, her briefing supported by satellite imagery and intercept data that painted a picture of ongoing conflicts that extended far beyond the domestic intelligence issues they'd been discussing. Medical support for special operations activities, counterintelligence operations designed to identify and neutralize foreign assets, and training programs for personnel who need to operate effectively in both civilian and military environments. The assignment would represent a complete return to the world of classified operations and dangerous assignments that Jess had tried to leave behind when she separated from military service. But it would also provide opportunities to use her specialized skills and training in ways that could make a genuine difference in protecting American interests and countering threats that most civilians would never know existed. "There's one more thing you should know before you make your decision," Blake said, producing a classified file that contained information about the broader intelligence implications of her involvement in the Patterson rescue. The Foreign Intelligence Service that was tracking the Pattersons has identified you as a high-value target for recruitment or elimination. Your capabilities and background make you exactly the kind of asset they need for their operations, and they'll be actively seeking opportunities to approach or neutralize you regardless of what choice you make about future assignments. The information meant that returning to civilian life would involve constant security risks and ongoing counterintelligence measures to protect her from foreign operatives who understood her strategic value. Even with a new identity and careful placement, she would be vulnerable to intelligence services that had the resources and motivation to track down assets with her specialized capabilities. Dr. Foster's concerns about Jess's background and training had intensified over the weeks following the mountain rescue, professional curiosity evolving into genuine worry as she realized that her colleagues' involvement in federal operations might have exposed her to ongoing security risks. The official explanations hadn't satisfied her questions about the sophisticated medical procedures and tactical equipment that had been employed during the rescue operation, and she'd begun conducting her own research into Jessica Turner's background and qualifications. "She's been asking questions that are getting closer to classified information," Walsh reported, consulting surveillance data that indicated Dr. Foster's inquiry had attracted the attention of federal security personnel. "We're going to need to brief her on operational security considerations or find ways to redirect her attention away from aspects of your background that can't be discussed publicly." The situation with Dr. Foster represented exactly the kind of security complication that made civilian cover identities difficult to maintain over extended periods. Professional relationships inevitably led to personal curiosity, and personal curiosity could lead to questions that exposed classified information or operational security concerns. The mountain rescue had created too much visibility and attention for Jessica Turner to return to complete anonymity as a small-town paramedic. "I'll accept the task force assignment," Jess said, making the decision that had been inevitable since the moment Captain Blake had arrived at the crash site 3 weeks earlier. "But I want operational autonomy and direct access to intelligence. Briefings rather than being managed as a support asset for operations, planned by people who don't understand medical and tactical integration requirements." Blake nodded, recognizing that someone with her background and capabilities would require the kind of operational independence that came with senior responsibility rather than subordinate support roles. "The task force is designed around personnel who can operate independently in complex environments where conventional command structures aren't practical or appropriate. You'll have the authority and resources necessary to plan and execute operations that require your specific combination of medical and tactical expertise." The assignment would take her away from Pine Valley permanently, but it would also provide opportunities to confront the foreign intelligence threats that had been developing against American interests for over a decade. Her involvement in the Patterson rescue had been just the beginning of a much larger confrontation between competing intelligence services one that would require specialized personnel with unique combinations of skills and experience to navigate successfully. Officer Johnson had submitted her report on the mountain rescue operation, but she'd also included questions about the federal response and the sophisticated capabilities that had been demonstrated by civilian personnel during the emergency. Her professional curiosity about Jessica Turner's background had been noted by federal security personnel, adding another layer of complexity to the operational security considerations surrounding the incident. Sheriff Crawford had been briefed on the classified aspects of the federal investigation and had agreed to cooperate with ongoing security measures. But his primary concern remained protecting the interests of local citizens and maintaining appropriate civilian oversight of federal activities within his jurisdiction. The mountain rescue had created ongoing federal presence in his county, and he wanted assurances that local citizens' rights and interests would be protected throughout the extended investigation. The Pine Valley community had been told that Jessica Turner had accepted a federal medical position that required immediate relocation, an explanation that satisfied casual curiosity while protecting the classified aspects of her new assignment. Dr. Foster had been briefed on operational security considerations and had agreed to redirect her professional inquiry away from classified information, though her concerns about her former colleague's safety would continue indefinitely. As the evening shadows lengthened across the mountain landscape where her civilian life had ended 3 weeks earlier, Jessica Turner prepared to return to the world of classified operations and dangerous assignments she'd thought she'd left behind forever. The quiet existence she'd built in Pine Valley had been partially artificial, but it had also provided her with valuable perspective on what she was fighting to protect, and why the intelligence operations she would now be conducting mattered for people who would never know they existed. The foreign intelligence services that had been developing assets and capabilities against American interests for over a decade would soon discover that their operations had attracted the attention of personnel with specialized training and experience, encountering exactly the kinds of threats they represented. For Jessica Turner, the assignment represented both a return to her professional roots and an opportunity to use her unique combination of medical and tactical capabilities in defense of the country and principles she'd sworn to protect. The mountain highway where her new life had begun was quiet now, marked only by scorched earth and twisted metal fragments that would be cleared away within days. But the consequences of what had happened there would continue to unfold across multiple countries and intelligence agencies, as the various players in a complex international confrontation discovered that some situations require personnel who can provide emergency medical care while maintaining operational security under hostile conditions that most people never have to imagine. 6 months after accepting the task force assignment, Jessica Turner found herself crouched behind the concrete barrier of a rooftop in Istanbul, Turkey, watching through night vision equipment as foreign operatives prepared to execute an operation that would compromise American intelligence assets across 3 continents. The weight of the modified rifle in her hands felt familiar despite the months she'd spent trying to live as a civilian. Muscle memory from years of special operations training reasserting itself as naturally as breathing. Target acquired. She whispered into her throat microphone, her voice steady despite the gravity of what she was about to do. 60 floors below, the city sprawled in all directions, millions of people going about their lives completely unaware that the next few minutes would determine whether a decade-long intelligence operation succeeded or failed catastrophically. The foreign intelligence cell she was targeting had spent years developing assets within American agencies, and tonight they were planning to extract those assets along with terabytes of classified information that could compromise ongoing operations worldwide. Captain Blake's voice crackled through her earpiece, his tone carrying the weight of command decisions that could affect international relations for years to come. You have authorization to engage when ready. Remember, we need at least one of them alive for interrogation, but your safety takes priority over intelligence collection. The authorization represented months of planning and intelligence gathering, legal reviews and operational approvals that had moved through the highest levels of government. Through her scope, Jess could see the 3 operatives who had been identified as the core of the extraction team, professional intelligence officers whose capture could provide invaluable information about foreign operations against American interests. But she could also see the 2 American assets they were planning to extract, people whose recruitment and exploitation represented years of foreign intelligence investment and whose exposure could destroy careers and potentially cost lives. The irony of her situation wasn't lost on her. 6 months ago, she'd been a small-town paramedic, whose biggest concern was managing medical emergencies and maintaining her civilian cover identity. Tonight she was preparing to engage in direct action against foreign intelligence operatives in a major international city, using skills and training that most people couldn't imagine and making decisions that would affect national security interests. She was only beginning to understand. The foreign operatives had chosen their extraction point carefully, a private helipad on top of a luxury hotel that provided multiple escape routes and minimal exposure to local law enforcement or security services. Their planning had been sophisticated and professional, taking into account surveillance capabilities and response times that would allow them to complete their mission and disappear before effective countermeasures could be implemented. But their planning hadn't anticipated the presence of a joint American-Turkish task force that had been tracking their activities for months, waiting for exactly this kind of operation to expose the full extent of their intelligence network. Jessica Turner's medical and tactical background had made her invaluable for operations that required personnel who could engage targets while providing emergency care for casualties and maintaining operational security under hostile conditions. Wind speed 2 knots from the northwest, temperature dropping, visibility excellent, she reported, providing environmental data that would affect the accuracy of long-range engagements. Her position on the adjacent building provided clear lines of sight to the extraction point, while offering multiple escape routes if the situation escalated beyond the planned parameters of the operation. The first American asset emerged from the stairwell access, a mid-level CIA analyst whose recruitment by foreign intelligence services had gone undetected for over 2 years. His nervous movements and constant checking of his surroundings indicated someone operating under extreme stress, aware that discovery would mean the end of his career and potentially his freedom. Behind him came the second asset, a Defense Department contractor whose access to classified weapon systems information had made him a high-value target for foreign recruitment efforts. Targets are moving into position, Blake reported from his overwatch position on the opposite side of the extraction site. Support teams are standing by for immediate response if needed. The operation had been planned with multiple layers of backup and contingency options, recognizing that engaging foreign intelligence operatives in a major international city carried significant risks for diplomatic complications and collateral damage. Jess adjusted her scope settings and controlled her breathing, falling into the familiar rhythm of precision marksmanship that had been drilled into her through years of special operations training. The distance was manageable, the environmental conditions were favorable, and her equipment was functioning perfectly. Everything depended on her ability to execute precise shots under pressure while making split-second decisions about target, priority, and engagement timing. The extraction helicopter appeared on the horizon exactly on schedule, its approach coordinated to minimize exposure time and provide maximum tactical advantage for the operatives on the ground. The pilot was maintaining radio silence and flying without navigation lights, professional techniques that indicated extensive experience with clandestine operations in hostile environments. Helicopter inbound, ETA 3 minutes, she reported, feeling the familiar calm that settled over her during high-stakes operations. The next few minutes would determine whether months of intelligence work and operational planning would succeed or fail. whether American assets could be recovered and foreign operations disrupted, or whether years of foreign intelligence investment would pay off with a successful extraction that compromised American interests across multiple theaters. The foreign operatives had spread out across the helipad in a defensive formation that provided mutual support while allowing rapid movement to the helicopter when it arrived. Their weapons were concealed but readily accessible, and their movements indicated professional training and extensive experience with similar operations. These weren't amateur terrorists or criminal opportunists. They were skilled intelligence officers conducting a sophisticated operation against American interests. "I have clear shots on all 3 primary targets," Jess reported, tracking each operative through her scope while calculating engagement sequences that would maximize the probability of success, while minimizing risks to American assets and civilian populations. "Secondary targets are exposed but moving. Recommend immediate engagement when helicopter begins approach." Blake confirmed her assessment while coordinating with other task force elements that were positioned around the extraction site, ready to provide support or conduct cleanup operations depending on how the engagement developed. Turkish intelligence services had been briefed on the operation and were providing indirect support, but the primary responsibility for success or failure rested with the American task force members who had the specialized training and equipment necessary for this kind of operation. The helicopter began its final approach, descending toward the helipad with professional precision, while maintaining the kind of tactical awareness that would allow rapid departure if the situation became compromised. Its arrival would trigger the final phase of the extraction operation, requiring immediate action from Jess and the other task force members to prevent the loss of American assets and classified information. "Engaging now," she announced, settling into her firing position and beginning the engagement sequence that would determine the outcome of months of planning and preparation. Her first shot took down the primary operative who was directing the Fang Vo extraction operation, a precise hit that eliminated the team leader while minimizing risks to nearby American assets. The second shot disabled the communications specialist who was coordinating with the helicopter, disrupting their command and control capabilities. The third operative reacted with professional speed, immediately moving to protect the American assets while returning fire toward Jess's position. His training and experience were evident in his tactical movements and weapon handling, making him a dangerous opponent who would require careful engagement to neutralize, without causing collateral damage or exposing American personnel to additional risks. Blake's team moved in from their concealed positions, using the confusion and disruption caused by Jess's initial engagement to close distance and gain tactical advantage over the remaining operatives. Their approach was coordinated and professional, taking advantage of superior numbers and positioning to overwhelm resistance while minimizing exposure to hostile fire. The helicopter pilot recognized that the extraction had been compromised and began immediate departure procedures, abandoning the ground team to preserve the aircraft and avoid capture by hostile forces. His decision was tactically sound from an operational perspective, but it left the remaining operatives without escape options and forced them into a defensive position that favored the attacking task force. Primary target down, secondary target neutralized, third target engaging from defensive position, Jess reported, tracking the remaining operative while providing cover fire for Blake's assault team. Her medical training allowed her to assess casualties in real time, determining which individuals required immediate attention and which could be left for later treatment during post-operation processing. The remaining foreign operative made the professional decision to surrender rather than continuing a firefight that he couldn't win, recognizing that capture might provide opportunities for prisoner exchange or intelligence value that death would eliminate entirely. His surrender allowed the task force to secure both American assets and valuable intelligence materials without additional casualties or complications. All targets secured, American assets recovered, intelligence materials under our control. Blake reported to the Task Force Operations Center, confirming the successful completion of an operation that had required months of planning and coordination between multiple agencies and international partners. The intelligence value of the captured materials and personnel would provide insights into foreign operations that could protect American interests for years to come. Jess maintained overwatch while the ground team processed the site and prepared for extraction, her medical expertise becoming essential as she assessed casualties and provided emergency treatment for wounded personnel. The foreign operative who had surrendered required treatment for a gunshot wound that was serious but not life-threatening, while one of the American assets was suffering from what appeared to be a stress-induced medical emergency. "Need immediate medical attention for Asset 2, she reported, recognizing symptoms that indicated cardiac distress brought on by the extreme stress of the extraction operation. Her dual role as sniper and medic allowed her to transition seamlessly between combat operations and emergency medical care, providing capabilities that conventional military or intelligence personnel couldn't match. The extraction helicopters arrived within minutes, specialized aircraft equipped for medical evacuation and tactical extraction that could handle casualties while maintaining operational security. Jess's medical equipment allowed her to stabilize the cardiac patient during transport while continuing to monitor the wounded foreign operative whose interrogation would provide valuable intelligence about ongoing operations against American interests. During the flight back to the secure facility where post-operation processing would take place, Jess reflected on how completely her life had changed since the mountain rescue operation that had exposed her civilian cover identity. The quiet existence she'd built in Pine Valley felt like a different lifetime, replaced by the complex and dangerous world of international intelligence operations, where her specialized training and experience were essential for protecting American interests. The intelligence materials recovered during the Istanbul operation revealed the extent of foreign penetration into American agencies and the sophistication of recruitment techniques that had been employed over many years. The information would require extensive analysis and investigation, but it provided unprecedented insights into how foreign intelligence services operated and how their activities could be countered effectively. Robert Patterson had continued to cooperate with American intelligence services, his debriefing sessions providing valuable information about foreign recruitment techniques and operational methods that complemented the intelligence recovered during operational activities like the Istanbul extraction. His recovery from the injuries sustained during the mountain rescue had been complete, but his future would be determined by legal proceedings that would balance his intelligence value against his criminal liability for the classified information he had stolen. Linda Patterson had accepted assignment to a joint task force that focused on analyzing foreign intelligence operations and developing countermeasures to protect American personnel from recruitment or exploitation. Her direct experience with foreign intelligence techniques made her valuable for understanding how these operations worked and how they could be disrupted, while her personal involvement provided motivation that couldn't be replicated through conventional training. Dr. Foster had been briefed on the classified aspects of Jessica Turner's background and had agreed to provide medical consultation for task force operations when her expertise was needed. Her civilian medical practice provided valuable cover for activities that required interaction with medical facilities and personnel who lacked appropriate security clearances, while her professional relationships allowed access to resources and information that might not be available through conventional intelligence channels. The Pine Valley community had accepted the official explanation that Jessica Turner had accepted a federal medical position requiring extensive travel and irregular communication, though some residents continued to ask questions about the circumstances of her departure and the unusual events that had preceded it. The mountain rescue operation had become local legend, with details growing more dramatic with each retelling until the true story was almost unrecognizable. Sheriff Crawford maintained cooperation with federal agencies operating in his jurisdiction, but his primary focus remained protecting local citizens and ensuring that federal activities didn't compromise public safety or community interests. The ongoing federal presence in his county had created opportunities for cooperation and resource sharing, but it had also required careful management to maintain appropriate civilian oversight and constitutional protections. Officer Johnson had been recruited for specialized training in counterintelligence techniques and federal cooperation procedures, her experience during the mountain rescue operation having demonstrated capabilities and judgment that made her valuable for ongoing operations that required coordination between federal agencies and local law enforcement. Her promotion within the state patrol system provided career advancement while maintaining her availability for federal assignments when needed. The foreign intelligence services that had been operating against American interests for over a decade discovered that their activities had attracted the attention of personnel with specialized training and experience in countering exactly the kinds of threats they represented. The Istanbul operation had been just one of several successful disruptions of foreign intelligence activities, each building on intelligence gathered from previous operations, to create a comprehensive understanding of how these networks operated and how they could be defeated. Jessica Turner's assignment to the Joint Task Force had evolved into a permanent position that utilized her unique combination of medical and tactical capabilities in operations that required personnel who could engage hostile forces while providing emergency care for casualties and maintaining operational security under challenging conditions. Her success in operations like Istanbul had established her reputation within the intelligence community as someone who could be trusted with the most sensitive and dangerous assignments. The task force had expanded to include personnel from multiple agencies and international partners. Recognition that modern intelligence threats required coordinated responses that transcended traditional organizational boundaries and national jurisdictions. Jessica's role within this expanded organization provided opportunities to influence policy and operational planning, while continuing to participate directly in field operations that utilized her specialized skills. 6 months after leaving Pine Valley, Jessica Turner had found a new purpose that combined her medical training with her tactical experience in ways that protected American interests while challenging foreign intelligence operations that threatened national security. The quiet life she'd tried to build as a civilian paramedic had been replaced by complex and dangerous international operations, but it had also provided her with perspective on what she was fighting to protect and why her specialized capabilities mattered for people who would never know she existed. The mountain highway where her civilian life had ended remained quiet, marked only by routine traffic and the occasional emergency response that brought local paramedics to deal with accidents and medical emergencies that were genuinely accidental rather than covers for intelligence operations. But the consequences of what had happened there continued to unfold across multiple countries and intelligence agencies, as various players in complex international confrontations discovered that some situations require personnel who can provide both emergency medical care and tactical response capabilities under conditions that most people never have to imagine. Her story had become legend within the specialized community of people who conduct operations that protect American interests in places and ways that never make the news. A reminder that the most effective assets are often those who appear unremarkable until circumstances demand the full application of their carefully hidden capabilities. For Jessica Turner, the transformation from small-town paramedic to international intelligence operative represented both a return to her professional roots and a new understanding of how her unique skills could be applied to challenges that required exactly her combination of medical expertise and tactical experience. 2 years later, Jessica Turner walked through the corridors of a specialized medical facility in Virginia, where she now trained the next generation of personnel who would carry forward the mission of protecting American interests in places most people couldn't imagine. The facility combined state-of-the-art medical training equipment with tactical simulation environments, creating an educational experience that prepared students for the complex realities of providing emergency care, while operating under hostile conditions that challenged conventional medical practice. Her office overlooked a training area where current students were practicing emergency surgical procedures, while simulated gunfire and explosions created the kind of stress and distraction they would encounter in real operations. The site reminded her of her own training years earlier, when she'd learned to maintain medical focus while combat situations unfolded around her, developing the mental discipline that had made her effective in operations like the Istanbul extraction. The phone on her desk rang with the distinctive tone that indicated a secure communication from the operations center. The kind of call that usually meant her expertise was needed for an ongoing situation that required immediate consultation or direct involvement. Despite her transition to training responsibilities, she maintained active status for operations that specifically required her unique combination of medical and tactical capabilities. "Turner here," she answered, activating the encryption protocols that protected sensitive communications from electronic surveillance or interception. Her voice carried the professional confidence that came from years of handling complex situations, where split-second decisions could determine the success or failure of critical operations. "Jessica, we've got a situation developing in Southeast Asia that requires your immediate attention," came the voice of Deputy Director Walsh, whose tone indicated that whatever was happening had moved beyond routine intelligence operations into something that demanded specialized response capabilities. "A foreign intelligence service has taken hostages at a medical conference in Singapore, including 3 American physicians who were attending under State Department cultural exchange programs." The implications were immediately clear to Jessica, whose understanding of international intelligence operations had expanded significantly during her 2 years with the task force. Foreign intelligence services didn't typically conduct hostage operations unless they were either desperate to recover compromised assets or attempting to force prisoner exchanges that would free their own personnel from American custody. Either scenario suggested that the situation in Singapore was connected to larger intelligence operations that extended beyond the immediate hostage crisis. "What's the intelligence assessment?" she asked, already mentally preparing for deployment while accessing secure databases that would provide background information on the personnel involved and the operational context that had led to the current crisis. Her training responsibilities could be transferred to other instructors, but her operational capabilities were unique enough that certain situations required her direct involvement. "The hostage takers are believed to be operatives from the same network we've been tracking since the Patterson case," Walsh explained, referencing the mountain rescue operation that had first exposed Jessica's civilian cover identity and led to her recruitment for specialized intelligence operations. "They're demanding the release of personnel we captured during operations in Istanbul and 3 other locations, suggesting this is a coordinated effort to recover assets rather than a random criminal act." The connection to previous operations meant that Jessica's involvement wasn't just professionally appropriate, but personally significant, since her actions during those operations had directly contributed to the capture of personnel the hostage takers were now trying to free. The Foreign Intelligence Service was essentially challenging her directly, creating a situation that required exactly her combination of medical expertise and tactical experience to resolve successfully. "Medical complications?" she asked, focusing on the aspects of the situation that would determine her specific role in whatever response was being planned. Hostage rescue operations typically involved multiple casualties and required immediate advanced medical care under extremely challenging conditions. Exactly the kind of scenario for which her specialized training had been designed. 2 of the American hostages have serious medical conditions that require ongoing treatment, Walsh reported, consulting intelligence files that contain detailed information about the individuals involved. Dr. Margaret Chun has diabetes that requires insulin management, and Dr. James Wilson has a cardiac condition that could become life-threatening under stress. The 3rd hostage, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, is a trauma surgeon whose medical expertise might be valuable for treating casualties during rescue operations. The medical complications added layers of complexity to any rescue operation, requiring personnel who could provide advanced medical care while conducting tactical operations under hostile conditions. Jessica's background made her uniquely qualified to handle situations where medical and tactical requirements had to be integrated seamlessly, but it also meant that her participation would be essential rather than optional. Timeline for deployment? She asked, already beginning the mental preparation that would allow her to transition from training responsibilities to active operations with minimal delay. Her students would understand that real-world requirements sometimes interrupted academic schedules, and her absence would provide them with valuable perspective on the operational realities they were training to handle. Wheels up in 4 hours. Walsh replied, confirming that the situation had moved beyond planning phases into immediate execution. You'll be joining a joint task force that includes personnel from multiple agencies and international partners, with primary responsibility for medical support during rescue operations and post-incident care for casualties and recovered hostages. The assignment represented a return to the kind of complex international operations that had defined her work since leaving Pine Valley, but it also demonstrated the trust and confidence that senior officials placed in her capabilities when situations required specialized expertise. Her reputation within the intelligence community had grown significantly during her 2 years with the task force, establishing her as someone who could be relied upon for the most challenging and sensitive assignments. After ending the secure communication, Jessica began the rapid preparation process that would allow her to deploy immediately while maintaining the training programs that were her primary responsibility. Her assistant would handle the administrative aspects of her absence, while other instructors would cover her classes and maintain the educational continuity that kept the training facility operating effectively. Her personal equipment was maintained in constant readiness for deployment, medical supplies and tactical gear configured for immediate use in various operational environments. The specialized equipment represented years of refinement and modification, tools that had been tested under real-world conditions and proven effective for operations that required both medical and tactical capabilities. The flight to Singapore provided time for detailed briefing on the hostage situation and the intelligence background that had led to the current crisis. The foreign operatives responsible for taking the hostages were professionals with extensive training and experience, making them dangerous opponents who would require careful planning and precise execution to neutralize without causing harm to the innocent people they were holding. Upon arrival in Singapore, Jessica was briefed by local authorities and international partners who had been tracking the foreign intelligence operations that culminated in the hostage crisis. The complexity of the situation required coordination between multiple agencies and governments, each with their own priorities and operational constraints that had to be balanced against the immediate need to rescue the American hostages safely. The medical facility where the hostages were being held had been chosen carefully by the operatives, providing defensive advantages while limiting access routes that could be used by rescue forces. The building's layout and security systems had been studied extensively by the hostage takers, suggesting advanced planning and reconnaissance that indicated sophisticated operational capabilities. Jessica's role in the rescue operation would combine her medical expertise with her tactical experience, providing emergency care for casualties, while participating directly in the assault that would free the hostages. Her unique capabilities allowed the task force to operate with greater flexibility and effectiveness, knowing that medical complications could be handled immediately rather than requiring evacuation to distant medical facilities. The operation began at dawn with coordinated assaults on multiple entry points, using surprise and overwhelming force to neutralize the hostage-takers before they could harm their captives. Jessica's position within the assault team allowed her to reach the hostages immediately, providing emergency medical care for the diabetic physician whose condition had deteriorated during captivity. Dr. Chun's insulin management had been deliberately disrupted by the hostage-takers, creating a medical emergency that would have become life-threatening without immediate intervention. Jessica's advanced medical training allowed her to stabilize the physician's condition while the tactical situation continued to develop around them, demonstrating the value of personnel who could operate effectively in both medical and combat environments. The rescue operation concluded successfully with all hostages recovered alive and all hostile operatives either captured or neutralized. But the intelligence implications extended far beyond the immediate tactical success. The Foreign Intelligence Service had revealed operational capabilities and personnel that would require ongoing counterintelligence efforts to neutralize completely. Jessica's performance during the Singapore operation reinforced her reputation as someone who could handle the most complex and challenging assignments, leading to additional opportunities for training development and operational planning that would shape how future personnel were prepared for similar situations. Her experience provided valuable insights into the integration of medical and tactical capabilities that would influence training programs for years to come. The rescued physicians returned to the United States with enhanced understanding of the international threats that could affect American citizens abroad, while their medical expertise provided valuable perspectives on how hostage situations could be managed to minimize health risks and complications. Their experience became part of the educational materials used to train other personnel who might face similar situations. Years after the mountain rescue operation that had ended her civilian life in Pine Valley, Jessica Turner had established herself as a leader in the specialized field of tactical medicine, training others while continuing to participate in operations that protected American interests worldwide. Her story had become inspiration for others who sought to combine medical expertise with tactical capabilities in service of missions that required both healing and protecting. The quiet paramedic who had once worked in a small Colorado town had evolved into a recognized expert whose influence extended across multiple agencies and international partnerships, demonstrating that sometimes the most effective careers develop from unexpected circumstances that reveal capabilities people didn't know they possessed. Her legacy would be measured not just in the operations she conducted, but in the personnel she trained to carry forward the mission of protecting others through the integration of medical excellence and tactical precision. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.